Welcome to Sinister Memory. If you're new here, subscribe now and let us know in the comments where you're listening to this story. Let's get to today's story. The first documented reference to what would later become known as Snow Village appears in the expedition logs of Dr. Marcus Whitmore, a geologist from the Smithsonian Institution who ventured into the remote Alaskan wilderness during the harsh winter of 1891. His initial observations, preserved in the institution's archives, describe an anomalous settlement discovered approximately 40 miles northeast of what is now Fairbanks, nestled within a valley that seemed to exist in perpetual winter, despite the seasonal changes affecting the surrounding terrain. Dr. Whitmore's party had been conducting a geological survey of mineral deposits when an unexpected blizzard forced them to seek shelter. Following what appeared to be an old trapper's trail, they descended into a valley shrouded in an unnatural stillness. The silence that greeted them was profound, broken only by the soft whisper of wind through ice-laden branches. What they discovered defied immediate comprehension. The village consisted of approximately 30 wooden structures, their architecture suggesting Russian colonial influence mixed with indigenous building techniques. Each building stood perfectly preserved beneath layers of pristine snow and ice, as if time itself had ceased its relentless march within the confines of this hidden valley. The structures showed no signs of decay or weathering, their logs appearing as fresh as the day they were hewn, despite what seemed to be decades of abandonment. Dr. Whitmore's initial survey revealed peculiarities that troubled his scientific mind. The snow surrounding the village exhibited an unusual crystalline structure, forming geometric patterns that seemed almost deliberate in their arrangement. Temperature readings taken at various points throughout the settlement showed consistent readings of -42 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of the time of day or the weather conditions above the valley rim. This temperature remained constant even when the expedition's instruments recorded significantly warmer conditions just beyond the village boundaries. The first dwelling the expedition entered belonged to what appeared to have been a family of 4. The interior remained remarkably well preserved, with personal belongings arranged as if the occupants had simply stepped away moments before. A wooden table held the remnants of a meal, the food preserved in a state of perfect crystallization. Children's toys lay scattered across the floor, their bright colors muted beneath a thin layer of frost that seemed to emanate from within the objects themselves, rather than settling from the air. Most disturbing to Dr. Whitmore and his companions was the complete absence of human remains. Despite clear evidence of recent habitation, no bodies were discovered within any of the structures. Beds remained unmade, as if their occupants had risen in haste. Personal effects suggested a community that had thrived in this remote location, with evidence of craftsmanship, agriculture adapted to harsh conditions, and a complex social structure indicated by the varying sizes and appointments of the dwellings. The expedition's photographer, James Hartwell, documented their findings with his camera equipment, though he noted in his personal journal that the photographic plates behaved strangely within the village boundaries. Images captured within the settlement appeared to develop with an unusual clarity, revealing details that had not been visible to the naked eye during the actual photography sessions. These photographs, now housed in the Smithsonian's restricted archives, show shadows and shapes that seem to move between frames, despite the static nature of the subjects. Dr. Whitmore's geological instruments detected magnetic anomalies throughout the village, with compass readings fluctuating wildly and barometric pressure showing impossible variations within short distances. The very ground beneath the settlement seemed to pulse, with an energy that defied scientific explanation, creating subtle vibrations that could be felt through the soles of their boots, but could not be measured by their equipment. As evening approached on their first day in the village, the expedition members reported a growing sense of unease that transcended mere discomfort with their surroundings. The silence that had initially struck them as peaceful began to feel oppressive, as if the very air was holding its breath in anticipation of some unnamed event. The constant temperature and the unchanging quality of light created a disorienting effect that made it difficult to judge the passage of time. Dr. Whitmore's final entry for that day noted his intention to conduct a more thorough investigation of the village's central structure, a building larger than the others that appeared to serve as some form of community center or meeting hall. His scientific curiosity had been thoroughly aroused by the anomalies they had discovered, and he expressed confidence that a systematic study would reveal the natural phenomena responsible for the village's remarkable preservation. The expedition would remain in Snow Village for 6 more days, during which their understanding of the settlement would deepen considerably, though their ability to explain what they had found would only become more elusive with each passing hour. The second day of Dr. Whitmore's expedition began with an examination of the village's most imposing structure, a 2-story building that dominated the settlement's center. Unlike the residential dwellings that surrounded it, this edifice bore elaborate carvings along its exterior walls, depicting scenes that seemed to blend Russian Orthodox iconography with symbols that predated European contact in the region. The building's entrance, framed by massive timber posts, stood slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond the threshold. Upon entering the central hall, the expedition members discovered a space that defied the modest exterior dimensions. The interior appeared significantly larger than the building's external measurements would suggest, an optical illusion that Dr. Whitmore attributed to the unusual lighting conditions within the structure. Pale luminescence seemed to emanate from the ice-covered walls themselves, creating a ghostly illumination that cast no discernible shadows. The main floor contained what had clearly served as a communal gathering space. Wooden benches arranged in concentric circles faced a raised platform at the far end of the room. Upon this platform stood an ornate lectern carved from what appeared to be a single piece of dark wood, its surface covered in the same mysterious symbols that adorned the building's exterior. The lectern's design incorporated flowing lines that seemed to writhe and shift when observed peripherally, though direct examination revealed only static carvings. Dr. Whitmore's assistant, Thomas Brennan, discovered a collection of bound volumes arranged on shelves that lined the eastern wall. These books, written in a mixture of Cyrillic script and an unknown symbolic language, contained detailed astronomical observations, weather patterns, and what appeared to be genealogical records spanning several generations. The pages, preserved by the same mysterious conditions that maintained the entire village, revealed a community that had tracked celestial movements with remarkable precision, noting correlations between lunar phases and local temperature fluctuations that seemed to defy meteorological understanding. The most significant discovery came when photographer James Hartwell noticed a narrow staircase leading to the building's upper level. The stairs, carved directly into the structure's supporting timbers, descended at an angle that created a disorienting sense of movement even when standing perfectly still. Each step bore intricate engravings that formed a continuous narrative as one ascended, though the story they told remained incomprehensible to the expedition members. The upper chamber revealed itself to be an observatory of sorts, with carefully positioned openings in the roof that aligned with specific constellations. Charts covering the walls mapped star patterns with extraordinary accuracy, including notations of celestial events that would not occur for decades into the future. Dr. Whitmore found these astronomical predictions particularly troubling, as they demonstrated a level of mathematical sophistication that seemed inconsistent with the village's apparent isolation from centers of learning. Most disturbing was the discovery of a detailed map depicting the village itself, but showing it in various states of transformation. The map contained multiple overlays, each representing the settlement at different points in time. Some versions showed the village bustling with activity, while others depicted it as completely abandoned. One particular overlay, drawn in what appeared to be a different hand, showed the village as it currently existed, frozen and empty, with a date notation that corresponded to approximately 70 years before Dr. Whitmore's arrival. The expedition's surveyor, Michael Donovan, made careful measurements of the observatory chamber and discovered that the room's dimensions changed subtly depending on the time of day. His instruments, calibrated that morning, showed variations of several inches in the chamber's length and width when measurements were repeated in the afternoon. These fluctuations followed no discernible pattern, though they seemed to correlate with the position of the sun relative to the valley's rim. As the team continued their examination, they began to notice that their own movements within the building seemed to echo strangely, as if the structure itself was responding to their presence. Footsteps on the wooden floors created reverberations that lasted longer than acoustics would normally allow, and the sound seemed to originate from multiple directions simultaneously. Dr. Whitmore noted that these auditory anomalies became more pronounced the longer they remained within the building. The temperature within the central hall remained consistent with the rest of the village, but the expedition members reported experiencing sudden fluctuations in their perception of warmth and cold that bore no relation to actual temperature readings. These sensations seemed to be triggered by proximity to certain areas of the building, particularly near the carved symbols that adorned the walls and the mysterious lectern on the main floor's platform. By evening, Dr. Whitmore had documented numerous anomalies that challenged his understanding of physics and architecture. The building appeared to exist in a state of temporal suspension similar to the rest of the village, but with additional properties that suggested a more complex relationship between the structure and the forces that preserved it. His growing unease was compounded by the realization that their presence in the village might be affecting the delicate equilibrium that had maintained its frozen state for 7 decades. The third morning brought a discovery that would fundamentally alter the expedition's understanding of Snow Village's true nature. While conducting a systematic search of the residential structures, Thomas Brennan made an observation that had escaped their notice during the initial survey. What they had previously assumed to be decorative ice formations within several of the dwellings were, upon closer examination, something far more disturbing. Within the largest residence at the village's northern edge, Brennan discovered what appeared to be human figures encased in crystalline ice so clear and perfect that they had initially been mistaken for elaborate sculptures. The ice formation stood in natural poses throughout the house, as if the occupants had been instantaneously frozen while going about their daily activities. A woman stood at a kitchen counter, her hand extended toward a wooden spoon, while a man sat in a chair near the fireplace, his posture suggesting he had been reading from a book that lay open on his lap. Dr. Whitmore's immediate examination revealed that these were not sculptures, but actual human beings, preserved in a state of perfect crystallization. The ice that encased them was unlike anything in his geological experience, possessing a clarity that seemed to magnify rather than obscure the details of the figures within. Their clothing, expressions, and even the texture of their skin remained visible with startling precision, as if they had been suspended between one moment and the next. The preservation was so complete that individual hairs could be distinguished, and the natural coloration of skin and fabric remained unchanged beneath the crystalline coating. Most remarkably, the figures' eyes remained open and clear, creating an unsettling impression that they were merely sleeping rather than deceased. Dr. Whitmore noted that the ice surrounding each figure maintained the same impossible temperature of -42 degrees Fahrenheit, yet showed no signs of melting or sublimation despite the presence of the expedition's body heat and lanterns. As the team expanded their search to other dwellings, they discovered similar scenes throughout the village. Each residence contained its complement of frozen inhabitants, all preserved in moments of ordinary domestic life. Children were found in bedrooms, their small forms curled beneath crystalline blankets of ice. An elderly man stood at a window, his gaze directed toward the village center as if he had been watching for something or someone. The positioning of the figures suggested that whatever phenomenon had created this preservation had occurred suddenly and without warning. There were no signs of struggle or attempts to flee, no evidence that the inhabitants had been aware of their impending fate. The scene implied a transformation so rapid that consciousness itself had been suspended between one heartbeat and the next. Photographer Hartwell's attempts to document these discoveries proved increasingly problematic. His camera equipment, which had functioned normally when photographing the empty structures, began producing images with disturbing aberrations when directed toward the frozen figures. The photographs revealed details that were not visible to the naked eye, including what appeared to be movement within the crystalline ice, as if the preserved inhabitants were somehow aware of being observed. Dr. Whitmore's scientific instruments detected unusual electromagnetic activity emanating from each frozen figure. The readings suggested that some form of biological process continued within the ice, though at a rate so dramatically reduced that it was barely detectable. This discovery challenged every principle of preservation and death that the doctor understood, implying that the villagers might exist in a state between life and death rather than true mortality. The expedition's surveyor, Michael Donovan, made careful counts and discovered that the village contained exactly 73 preserved inhabitants, ranging in age from infants to elderly adults. The demographic distribution suggested a thriving, multi-generational community that had been cut short at the height of its prosperity. Personal effects and the quality of clothing indicated a settlement that had achieved considerable success despite its remote location. Most disturbing was the discovery that several of the frozen figures appeared to be positioned as if they had been looking toward the central hall at the moment of their preservation. Their gazes, clearly visible through the transparent ice, all seemed directed toward the mysterious building that had served as the community's focal point. This pattern suggested that whatever had occurred in Snow Village had originated from or been centered upon the structure that Dr. Whitmore's team had investigated the previous day. As evening approached, the expedition members reported experiencing an increasing sense of being observed. The sensation seemed to emanate from the frozen figures themselves, as if the preserved inhabitants were somehow aware of the intrusion into their suspended existence. Dr. Whitmore noted that this feeling was strongest when standing in direct line of sight with any of the crystallized villagers, regardless of the distance involved. The doctor's final observations for the day included measurements indicating that the ice surrounding the figures was gradually expanding, growing thicker by microscopic amounts with each passing hour. This discovery raised the troubling possibility that the preservation process was not static, but continued to evolve, potentially affecting anything that remained within the village's boundaries for an extended period. The fourth day of investigation yielded the expedition's most significant breakthrough when Thomas Brennan discovered a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards of what appeared to have been the village priest's residence. Within this concealed space lay a collection of journals written in Church Slavonic, along with several documents bearing the seal of the Russian Orthodox Church. These materials, preserved with the same supernatural clarity as everything else in the village, provided the first written account of Snow Village's final days. The journals belonged to Father Dmitry Volkov, who had served as the settlement's spiritual leader for over 2 decades before the mysterious event that had frozen the community in time. His entries, meticulously translated by Dr. Whitmore using his knowledge of ecclesiastical languages, revealed a gradual descent into circumstances that defied rational explanation. The priest's handwriting, initially steady and confident, became increasingly erratic as the entries progressed toward their abrupt conclusion. Father Dimitri's earliest entries described a thriving community that had established itself in the valley during the 1810s, composed primarily of Russian fur traders, indigenous hunters, and their families. The village had prospered through careful management of resources and harmonious relations between its diverse inhabitants. The priest wrote with evident pride about the construction of the central hall, which had served both as a community meeting place and an informal chapel for religious services. The first indication of unusual phenomena appeared in entries dated approximately 6 months before the village's apparent preservation. Father Dimitri noted strange atmospheric disturbances that seemed to originate from deep within the valley itself. The aurora borealis, typically visible only during certain seasons, began appearing with increasing frequency and intensity, often displaying colors that the priest described as unnatural and disturbing to observe. More troubling were the priest's observations regarding the behavior of local wildlife. Animals that had previously shown no fear of human presence began avoiding the valley entirely, while domestic livestock exhibited signs of extreme agitation during certain lunar phases. Father Dimitri documented instances where the village's sled dogs would howl in unison for hours, their cries directed toward the central hall despite no apparent stimulus. The journals revealed that the villagers had begun experiencing shared dreams of remarkable vividness and consistency. Multiple residents reported identical visions of the village covered in crystalline ice, with themselves as observers rather than participants in the frozen tableau. These dreams occurred with such regularity that Father Dimitri began conducting informal interviews with the affected individuals, documenting their accounts in meticulous detail. Most disturbing were the priest's records of temporal anomalies that had begun manifesting throughout the settlement. Clocks and timepieces, previously reliable, began displaying different times despite being wound and set simultaneously. Residents reported experiencing periods where time seemed to slow dramatically, with simple tasks requiring what felt like hours to complete, while their timepieces indicated that only minutes had passed. Father Dimitri's scientific curiosity led him to conduct careful observations of these temporal disturbances. He documented instances where shadows moved independently of their sources, where candle flames burned for impossible durations without consuming their wax, and where written words appeared to change when not directly observed. The priest's rational mind struggled to reconcile these phenomena with his understanding of natural law, leading to increasingly desperate attempts at explanation. The final entries revealed Father Dimitri's growing conviction that the village had become the focus of forces beyond human comprehension. He wrote extensively about his research into indigenous legends of the valley, discovering oral traditions that spoke of a place where time itself could be captured and held motionless. These stories, previously dismissed as folklore, began to seem prophetic as the village's situation deteriorated. The priest's last coherent entry described a community meeting held in the central hall to discuss the escalating anomalies. The villagers had gathered to decide whether to abandon their homes and seek refuge elsewhere, despite the approaching winter that would make travel extremely dangerous. Father Dimitri noted that the discussion had been interrupted by a phenomenon he could only describe as the air itself becoming visible, taking on a crystalline quality that seemed to spread outward from the hall's central platform. The journal's final page contained only a few fragmented sentences, written in handwriting so deteriorated that translation proved nearly impossible. The words that could be deciphered spoke of cold beyond description, of time becoming solid, and of a choice that was no longer theirs to make. The entry ended mid-sentence, the ink trailing off as if the writer's hand had simply stopped moving. Dr. Whitmore's analysis of the journals revealed that the final entry was dated exactly 70 years before their arrival in the village. The precision of this timing, combined with the priest's prophetic descriptions of crystalline preservation, suggested that Father Dimitri had somehow foreseen the fate that would befall his community. The implications of this prescience added another layer of mystery to an already incomprehensible situation. The fifth day brought revelations that challenged the expedition's fundamental understanding of reality itself. Dr. Whitmore's careful chronological analysis of Father Dimitri's journals had revealed discrepancies that initially appeared to be translation errors, but proved to be something far more disturbing. The priest's final entries described events occurring over a period of several weeks, yet the dates indicated that only 3 days had passed between the first signs of temporal anomaly and the village's ultimate preservation. This discovery prompted Dr. Whitmore to conduct a systematic examination of time's behavior within the village boundaries. Using his pocket chronometer as a reference point, he established observation posts at various locations throughout the settlement. What he discovered defied every principle of physics he had studied during his academic career. Time itself appeared to flow at different rates depending on one's position within the village, with the central hall serving as the epicenter of the most severe distortions. Near the village's outer perimeter, chronometer readings remained consistent with normal temporal flow. However, as one moved closer to the central hall, time began to slow perceptibly. At the building's threshold, Dr. Whitmore's chronometer indicated that nearly an hour had passed, while his reference timepiece, observed from a distance by Thomas Brennan, showed only minutes had elapsed. This temporal gradient created a disorienting effect that made coordinated activities between team members increasingly difficult. The photographer, James Hartwell, made an unsettling discovery while reviewing his previous day's work. Photographs taken in sequence showed impossible progressions of shadow and light that suggested hours had passed between exposures that his records indicated were taken only minutes apart. More disturbing still, some images captured within the central hall showed the frozen villagers in slightly different positions than they had been observed to occupy, as if the crystallized inhabitants were somehow moving at an imperceptible rate. Michael Donovan's surveying equipment revealed that the village's physical dimensions were subject to the same temporal distortions affecting chronological measurements. Distances that measured consistently when calculated from outside the settlement showed significant variations when measured from within. The central hall, in particular, seemed to exist in a state of spatial flux, with its interior dimensions expanding and contracting according to patterns that correlated with the intensity of temporal anomalies. Dr. Whitmore's investigation of the Central Hall's platform revealed the source of these disturbances. Beneath the ornate lectern, concealed by carved panels that had initially appeared to be decorative elements, lay a chamber containing what could only be described as a temporal mechanism of unknown origin. The device, if it could be called such, consisted of crystalline formations arranged in geometric patterns that seemed to pulse with an inner light synchronized to no earthly rhythm. The crystals themselves defied classification according to any known mineralogical system. They appeared to be composed of frozen time itself, their faceted surfaces reflecting not light, but moments from the village's past and future. Dr. Whitmore observed scenes of the settlement's construction, its years of prosperity, and its final moments of preservation, all playing simultaneously within the crystal's depths, like memories trapped in solid form. The mechanism's operation seemed to be governed by astronomical alignments that Father Dimitri had documented in his journals. The priest's careful observations of celestial movements had unknowingly tracked the approach of a rare planetary conjunction that occurred only once every 70 years. This alignment, combined with the valley's unique geological properties, and the villagers' inadvertent activation of the ancient device had created the conditions necessary for temporal crystallization. Dr. Whitmore's analysis suggested that the village existed in a state of temporal suspension rather than true preservation. The inhabitants were not dead in any conventional sense, but were instead experiencing time at such a dramatically reduced rate that 70 years of external time equated to mere moments of their subjective experience. This revelation carried profound implications for the expedition's own safety, as prolonged exposure to the temporal field might result in their own gradual crystallization. The team's instruments began showing signs of temporal contamination as the day progressed. Compass needles moved in slow, hypnotic patterns that followed no magnetic principles, while barometric readings fluctuated in ways that suggested the very air was becoming unstable. Most concerning was the discovery that their own movements were beginning to slow when observed from outside the village's influence, indicating that the temporal field was gradually expanding its reach. As evening approached, Dr. Whitmore made the difficult decision to establish a base camp beyond the village boundaries. The risk of temporal entrapment had become too great to ignore, yet the scientific importance of their discoveries demanded continued observation. The team's withdrawal from the settlement revealed that they had been affected more than initially realized, with their chronometers showing significant discrepancies when compared to timepieces that had remained outside the village's influence. The implications of their discoveries weighed heavily on Dr. Whitmore's mind as he prepared his evening notes. They had uncovered evidence of forces that operated beyond the boundaries of known science, yet their ability to study these phenomena was limited by the very dangers they posed. The sixth day marked a turning point in the expedition's understanding of Snow Village's true nature, as Dr. Whitmore's team discovered that the temporal anomalies were not contained within the settlement's original boundaries. During their morning observations from the established base camp, Thomas Brennan noticed that the crystalline formations extending from the village had grown measurably overnight, advancing several feet toward their position with geometric precision. The expansion followed no random pattern, but instead traced specific lines across the landscape that corresponded to underground geological features. Dr. Whitmore's examination revealed that the temporal field was following natural fault lines and mineral deposits, using the Earth's own structure as a conduit for its influence. This discovery suggested that the phenomenon was not merely supernatural, but operated according to principles that interfaced with natural law in ways that current science could not explain. Photographer Hartwell's documentation of the expansion revealed disturbing details that were not visible to casual observation. His camera captured the crystallization process in action, showing how organic matter was gradually transformed into the same transparent ice that preserved the village inhabitants. Trees at the expansion's edge stood partially crystallized, their trunks showing a clear demarcation between normal wood and the supernatural preservation that was slowly consuming them. The rate of expansion appeared to be accelerating with each passing hour. What had initially progressed at a pace of inches per day was now advancing at several feet per hour, creating an ever-widening circle of temporal suspension centered on the village's central hall. Dr. Whitmore's calculations indicated that at the current rate of growth, the phenomenon would reach their base camp within 48 hours. More troubling was the discovery that the expansion was not uniform in all directions. The temporal field showed a marked preference for areas with higher concentrations of living matter, advancing more rapidly toward forests and wildlife habitats while moving more slowly across barren ground. This selective progression suggested an intelligence behind the phenomenon that was actively seeking to preserve as much life as possible within its crystalline embrace. The team's instruments detected increasing electromagnetic disturbances as the temporal field approached their position, compass readings became completely unreliable, spinning wildly before settling on directions that bore no relation to magnetic north. The expedition's chronometers began showing greater discrepancies, with some timepieces running fast, while others slowed dramatically, creating a cacophony of ticking that followed no synchronized rhythm. Dr. Whitmore's analysis of Father Dimitri's journals revealed additional details that had been overlooked during his initial translation. The priest had documented similar expansions during previous astronomical alignments, though on a much smaller scale. These earlier events had been dismissed by the villagers as natural phenomena, but Father Dimitri's careful observations showed a pattern of gradual growth that culminated in the catastrophic preservation of the entire settlement. The journals indicated that the temporal mechanism beneath the central hall had been activated inadvertently during a community gathering held to discuss the village's future. The villagers' collective presence in the hall during the precise moment of astronomical alignment had provided the energy necessary to trigger the device's full potential. What had been intended as a democratic discussion about their community's direction had instead become the catalyst for their eternal preservation. Michael Donovan's surveying work revealed that the expanding temporal field was creating physical changes in the landscape itself. The ground within the affected area was becoming harder and more crystalline, taking on properties similar to the ice that preserved the village inhabitants. This transformation extended deep into the earth, creating a foundation of temporal stability that seemed designed to support the preservation indefinitely. As the day progressed, the expedition members began experiencing the early effects of temporal exposure despite their distance from the village proper. Their movements felt increasingly sluggish, and simple tasks required greater concentration to complete. Most disturbing was the gradual synchronization of their biological rhythms, with heartbeats and breathing patterns beginning to match despite their different physical conditions. Dr. Whitmore realized that their window for escape was rapidly closing. The temporal field's expansion would soon make retreat impossible, trapping them within the same crystalline preservation that had claimed the village 70 years earlier. Yet the scientific importance of their observations created a moral dilemma that weighed heavily on his conscience. The knowledge they had gained could revolutionize understanding of time and preservation, but only if someone survived to share it with the outside world. The seventh day brought the expedition to a crossroads that would determine not only their immediate survival, but the fate of their extraordinary discoveries. Dr. Whitmore awoke to find that the temporal field had advanced to within 50 yards of their base camp during the night, its crystalline boundary clearly visible as a shimmering wall that distorted the air like heat waves rising from summer pavement. The phenomenon's acceleration had exceeded all previous calculations, suggesting that proximity to living beings somehow catalyzed its expansion. The team's equipment had begun exhibiting severe malfunctions that went beyond simple temporal distortion. Photographic plates developed images of events that had not yet occurred, showing the expedition members in various states of crystalline preservation. These prophetic photographs displayed disturbing accuracy in their depiction of the camp's layout and the positioning of equipment, as if the temporal field possessed the ability to perceive multiple possible futures simultaneously. Dr. Whitmore's scientific instruments registered readings that challenged the fundamental principles of physics. Temperature measurements showed impossible gradients where crystallized air existed at sub-zero temperatures while maintaining the transparency and breathability of normal atmosphere. Barometric pressure readings fluctuated wildly, suggesting that the temporal field was creating pockets of altered space-time that operated according to different physical laws. The most disturbing development was the discovery that the expedition members themselves were beginning to show signs of temporal contamination. Thomas Brennan noticed that his shadow had started to lag behind his movements, creating a disorienting effect where his silhouette appeared to be following him rather than moving in synchronization. James Hartwell found that his reflection in metallic surfaces showed him in positions he had occupied minutes earlier, as if his image was being preserved in temporal layers. Michael Donovan's surveying equipment revealed that the space within their camp was becoming geometrically unstable. Distances between objects fluctuated according to no discernible pattern, with measurements taken from different positions yielding contradictory results. The very ground beneath their feet seemed to be developing the same crystalline properties observed within the village, though at a much slower rate of transformation. Dr. Whitmore's analysis of their situation led to a grim conclusion. The temporal field's expansion was not merely growing outward, but was also intensifying at its center. The village itself was becoming increasingly removed from normal time, with the crystallized inhabitants now existing in a state of temporal suspension so profound that they might experience the passage of centuries as mere moments. This deepening effect suggested that escape would become progressively more difficult as the field continued to strengthen. The expedition faced an impossible decision. Immediate retreat offered the possibility of survival, but would mean abandoning the most significant scientific discovery in human history. The temporal mechanism beneath the central hall represented technology that could revolutionize understanding of time, preservation, and the fundamental nature of reality itself. Yet attempting to document or retrieve this knowledge carried the near certainty of joining the village's crystallized inhabitants in their eternal suspension. Dr. Whitmore's conscience was torn between his scientific duty and his responsibility to his team. The knowledge they had gained could benefit all of humanity, but only if someone survived to share it. The temporal field's expansion showed no signs of slowing, and their window for escape was measured in hours rather than days. Each moment of delay increased the risk that they would become permanent additions to Snow Village's preserved population. The team's personal effects began showing signs of temporal contamination that made the urgency of their situation undeniable. Pocket watches ran backward, written notes appeared to age and fade before their eyes, and food supplies took on the crystalline properties that characterized everything within the temporal field's influence. These changes accelerated as the boundary drew closer, suggesting that the field's effects intensified exponentially with proximity. As evening approached, Dr. Whitmore made preparations for what might be their final night of normal temporal existence. His journal entries became increasingly frantic as he attempted to record every detail of their discoveries, knowing that these notes might represent the only record of Snow Village's secrets that would ever reach the outside world. The weight of scientific responsibility pressed heavily upon him as he contemplated the choice between knowledge and survival. The temporal field's boundary now stood less than 20 yards from their camp, its approach marked by the gradual crystallization of the surrounding landscape. Trees, rocks, and even the air itself took on the transparent, preserved quality that had claimed the village decades earlier. Time was running out, and Dr. Whitmore knew that within hours they would face the same fate as Father Dimitri and his congregation. The 8th and final day of Dr. Whitmore's expedition began with the temporal field's boundary standing mere feet from their camp, its crystalline edge advancing with inexorable certainty toward their position. The phenomenon had accelerated beyond all previous measurements, suggesting that the proximity of conscious observers somehow fed its expansion. Dr. Whitmore realized with growing clarity that their very presence had catalyzed the field's growth, making them unwitting participants in their own preservation. The morning brought a revelation that fundamentally altered Dr. Whitmore's understanding of their predicament. While reviewing Father Dimitri's journals one final time, he discovered a passage that had been obscured by temporal distortion during his earlier translations. The priest had written about previous expeditions that had discovered the village during its dormant periods, describing how each group of visitors had triggered a new cycle of expansion that ultimately claimed them as permanent residents. The pattern was unmistakable. Snow Village existed in a state of temporal hibernation between astronomical alignments, appearing as nothing more than an abandoned settlement to occasional travelers. However, the presence of living beings during specific celestial configurations activated the temporal mechanism, beginning a preservation cycle that would not cease until all witnesses had been incorporated into the village's eternal tableau. Dr. Whitmore and his team were not the first to make this discovery, nor would they be the last. The expedition's equipment had become completely unreliable, with instruments providing readings that defied interpretation. Cameras captured images of the team in various states of crystallization, showing their gradual transformation into the same transparent preservation that characterized the village inhabitants. These photographs revealed details that were not yet visible to the naked eye, suggesting that the crystallization process had already begun at a molecular level. Thomas Brennan was the first to show visible signs of temporal preservation. His movements had slowed to a barely perceptible pace, and his skin had taken on the translucent quality observed in the village's frozen residents. Yet his eyes remained alert and aware, tracking the movements of his companions with an intelligence that suggested consciousness persisted even as physical transformation progressed. The preservation was not death, but rather a transition to a different state of existence. James Hartwell's photographic documentation of their final hours revealed the true scope of the temporal field's influence. His images showed that the phenomenon extended far beyond the visible boundaries, creating layers of temporal distortion that affected reality itself. The photographs captured moments from the village's past and future simultaneously, showing the settlement in various states of occupation and abandonment across multiple time periods. Michael Donovan's final survey measurements indicated that the temporal field was approaching a state of equilibrium that would stabilize the preservation indefinitely. The expansion would cease once all living matter within the affected area had been crystallized, creating a perfect temporal snapshot that would endure until the next astronomical alignment triggered a new cycle of growth. The village would then return to dormancy, waiting for the next group of discoverers to activate its ancient mechanism. Dr. Whitmore's last coherent journal entry described his growing understanding of the village's true purpose. The temporal mechanism was not a weapon or accident, but rather a preservation system designed to capture and maintain moments of human existence for reasons that remained incomprehensible. The crystallized inhabitants were not victims, but rather specimens, preserved in perfect detail for observation by intelligences that operated on temporal scales beyond human comprehension. As the crystallization process claimed his own body, Dr. Whitmore experienced a profound shift in perception. Time became visible as a flowing substance that could be shaped and molded like clay. The village's inhabitants were not frozen, but rather existed in a state of temporal suspension that allowed them to observe the passage of centuries as brief moments. Their consciousness remained intact, expanded beyond the limitations of normal human experience. The expedition's final transformation occurred as the sun reached its zenith, completing the astronomical alignment that had triggered the preservation cycle. Dr. Whitmore felt his awareness expand to encompass not only his own experience, but that of every person who had ever been claimed by the temporal field. He joined a collective consciousness that spanned generations, becoming part of an eternal vigil that watched over the village and waited for the next cycle to begin. The temporal field stabilized, returning Snow Village to its dormant state. To future travelers, it would appear as nothing more than an abandoned settlement, its crystallized inhabitants invisible until the proper conditions aligned to reveal their presence. The village would wait, patient and eternal, for the next group of explorers to discover its secrets and join its timeless congregation in their endless watch over the frozen valley. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Sinister Memory. If you enjoyed today's investigation, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell to be alerted when we unveil our next dark chronicle. Share your thoughts about this case in the comments below. We read every single one, and your ideas often lead us to our next investigation. Until next time.